pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Go ahead and let Carol kick us off.
Good morning, Commissioners. Carol Muller, Commission Office. Welcome to the first fiscal year 24 budget meeting. While this may be the first official meeting, there has been months of work that has gone into to get us this particular far. You've heard from departments over the past 5 months as they've teed up for you any additional requests they would be making. Each department has a liaison, and I hope, anticipate, and pretty much know that all of you have been meeting with those people and vetting those budgets before they even got turned into the auditor's office the first week of May. The budgets that you're being presented today are very pragmatic. About 18 months ago, we started building an 8-year outlook, which then became part of the FAN, or the Financial Action Network review. With their direction, you'll see financial projections for the next 5 years. We want to make sure that you're fully aware where you will be in the next few years instead of just looking at fiscal year 2024. This has been a significant step forward for us and positions you in a much better place than you've been in previous years to make these decisions. At the end of the meeting, I'll recap future dates, but just as a reminder, you are having budget meetings next Tuesday and next Thursday. So with that, and one last reminder, these meetings are being streamed, so there are people watching on YouTube or on our website, but they are not being broadcast, and they will be available for future viewing on our website also. Thank you.
All right.
We're off and running.
Thank you, Carol. All right, so that takes us, I would consider a motion to approve our agenda.
Move to approve.
Second.
Motion and a second, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. That takes us to item 1. Carol's already done that. And then we will go to item 2, which is the auditor's office. Good morning.
Good morning. Leah Anderson, County Auditor. Like Carol said, today we begin the first of many conversations of the 2024 budget. Our presentation will focus heavily on general fund, current, historical, and forecasted financial information, so you can make an informed budgetary decision for 2024. I thank you for your time, and Susan Beeman has put a lot of work into this, and so I'm going to turn it over to her to walk through the presentation.
Thank you.
Yep.
Good morning.
Susan. You're going to reach for your Dr. Pepper. You might need that too.
Maybe in a little bit. Susan Beeman with the Auditor's Office. We're going to start today just reviewing the timeline of what the budget is. As Carol indicated, this really starts back at the beginning of the year. Today, we're at this time in the timeline where we're doing the budget conversations over the next 3 meetings. After that, in July are some very key dates. If there is a need to pass a new opt-out, that deadline by statute is July 15th. That's referenced on here just to keep that in front of us, as well as we are required to have the provisional budget adopted by the end of July and have that published and by July 30th. So that would be done at the July 25th meeting, with final budget, the public hearing for the budget meeting taking place in early September, with final adoption by the end of September. So just a high-level overview of our timeline. So we're just getting started on meetings about budget. So first, what we're going to do is review just our current financial information and go through some of the graphs that you see every month, just to kind of point through a few pieces of that. All of these graphs are going to be as of April and April 30th. With the budget meetings being moved up about a week, we couldn't get you May data in time because that just closed yesterday. So what you see on this slide in front of you is our general fund cash reserves. Just a reminder, when you look at this, you see lots of peaks and valleys. So for example, our March cash is quite a bit lower, and then you see in April a big increase in cash. That is just the biannual payments of property taxes for most of our taxpayers, so that is a very normal trend for us. But also just to keep in mind, when you look at that cash level of about 25.5 million, it sounds like a lot of money, but in reality, it's just over 3.5 months cash on hand. So just trying to keep that in perspective of what that money means in the realm of total appropriations for the county. Okay. Next is our highway fund cash balance. Again, it's still it's healthy based upon April numbers of about 11.2 million in balance. Again, this is one that also has some peaks and valleys, but their peaks and valleys are more on the spending side because they spend their large dollars in the summer and the fall as they're doing road projects. So where you can see those declines later in the year, that's very normal for the highway fund. Next, on to our total revenue. Again, these are all very consistent trending in prior years to prior year budget as well as current year budget. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through these just because they are very much in line with our normal historical trends. With the next slide being year-to-date taxes, again, it's a slight increase for 2023 revenue, but that's expected with the increase in taxes that were budgeted for 23. Again, still very much trending as to normal budget. For year-to-date other revenues, you'll see a slight decline comparative to 2022. The key factor to that is just the slowing of spending in South Dakota Cares, that the grant funding that we are helping to administer from the state of South Dakota. The overall, just the slowing of that program due to timelines and other factors is the main driver of that decline. For year-to-date total expenditures, again, very consistent trending with prior year, a slight increase from prior year on expenses. Again, that is normal with how budget appropriations were done for 23 budget. Same story with year-to-date personnel expenses. Again, trending very, very normal to budget, a little bit higher than last year based upon the increase in budget for personnel expenses. And then finally, for the monthly graphs, you'll see, again, a slight decline in other expenses. And again, that too is related to South Dakota Cares and just the slowing of that. So whatever we receive in grant revenue is being paid out. So you're seeing the decline on the revenue, you're also seeing the decline on the expenses. I'll just pause there before we go into the next section. Any questions?
Any questions? See a lot of thoughtful expressions, but no
Madam Chair,
questions yet.
one-
Commissioner
Just
Kipley?
when we go back to our general fund cash reserves, I know we got some guidance from the fan that we should be considering a budget reserve level. And what would your opinion be on 2019 and 2020? Are those abnormally low, historically low, or if you went further back in time, what do you think? Those just seem a little bit on the low side.
I would say we historically have not had a policy regarding how much we should have in unapplied cash reserves. That is something that the FAN committee had recommended we consider either formally adopting or in some way setting a threshold for that. We do know, as part of the FAN preparation, we had went back 2010, 2011 timeframe, somewhere around there. And back in that timeframe, cash was very low for the county. And then slowly over the last 10 years, it's been inching up to be a more stable amount of reserves. The balance back in the early 2010 was considerably low. And so FAN did not set out a recommendation. I can tell you that as part of our bond financing for the Juvenile Justice Center, the analysts indicated that She felt if our unapplied cash reserves dipped below 20%, that would be cause for consideration of lowering our bond rating. And so there is no formal recommendation at this point. You know, I would probably throw out a 25% is probably one where I would say that we should start that as a consideration.
Okay, I'm sure we'll be talking more about reserves, but that's enough for now. Thanks.
Thank you.
So next, we're going to just go through summary of existing opt-outs. We do have opt-outs in 2 of our funds. Starting with the building fund, we have $1,410,000 in opt-outs that are currently passed and levied. Just one thing to note, the one for the HHS building is expires at the end of 2025, meaning that opt-out of $260,000 a year will drop off in 2026. That coincides with the payoff of the debt that is financing. So that one you'll see down the road go away. General fund, we currently have opt-outs passed of $16,125,000, of which we are levying $14,003,000 as of 2023 budget. So that leaves just over $2.1 million left in past opt-outs that you could decide to levy at any point without further consideration. One thing to note, as we look at the forecast, you will see that this $1.625 million opt-out is set to expire at the end of 26. So that opt-out will be good through 26, but then starting in 2027, that will no longer be available. To replace it, you would have to pass a new opt-out or somehow work that into a budget. And that's accounted for in our forecast as we get down the road.
Madam Chair?
Commissioner.
Trying to remember statutorily, is there a time limit that we have to, I know we have to put a time limit on an opt-out, but I see most of these are 20. Is that just kind of what past commission boards have decided?
Those were prior to my time, but my understanding is that past commissions thought that a 20-year time frame was reasonable and allowed for the commission to revisit the need for it down the road.
Okay.
Carol, anything to add?
Commissioner Carol Muller, the one thing I would add to it is that I believe you have the ability to go up to 99 years
That's
for an
what I was
opt-out.
wondering. Okay.
Yes, that you do. The one, when we've talked about that in the past, I remember one commissioner said, well, that really didn't care to go that long, but felt that that allowed us to revisit this. And also, hope springs eternal that things could change in Pierre.
So now we're going to move forward into the requested budget. So the requested budget information that we'll present is what the department heads and other departments put into their budget requests. These numbers do not include new opt-out. It does not include new personnel, but we'll walk through that as we go through that. So just keep that in mind, that none of the requested personnel are reflected in these numbers as we go forward. So high level, and we'll go through each of these areas a little bit deeper so you can see the things that make them up. But just at a very high level, our general fund revenue, you can see 2 big spikes. And again, those are coinciding with COVID relief dollars in 2020, as well as ARPA funding and South Dakota CARES money in 2022. So the rest of the information you can see are very consistent with historical trends. But as we get into the next slides, you'll see the details of what make up each of those areas to dive a little bit deeper in. So you'll see this is now moving on to property taxes, which is one of our key revenues for the county. You can see that we are showing a property tax requested budget of just over $43.3 million. That includes the current growth in CPI as allowed by state statute. Opt-out is left at this point at previous opt-outs of just over $14 million. And just to remind everyone, opt-out, there are no growth in CPI and opt-outs. So they stay consistent as you go forward. So just over just under $58 million with our total property tax revenue budgeted for 2024. Okay? If at any point you guys have questions, please stop me. I don't want to go too fast, but I also don't, I know we have a lot to cover, so.
If I may.
Commissioner Karski.
I know there's been a lot of work internally with, laddering our deposits and interest revenues. Is that shown in here anywhere? And, I mean, there's been some increase or probably significant increase.
In our interest income?
Yeah.
Yes, we will get to that on the miscellaneous revenue side, so you
Okay.
can see the
Good
increase
enough.
there.
Thank you.
This is a little bit deeper dive on property tax statistics, looking back from 2019 through 2024 requested budget. As you can see, over here on the right column is the data we just walked through of just under $58 million in total tax revenue. Of that amount, just over 24% of our total tax revenue is opt-out dollars. That's a key number to kind of keep in front of you as we continue our budget conversations. So the increase in taxes from CPI, which just to remind everyone, we are capped at actual CPI or 3%, whichever is less. So in the case of 2024, actual CPI, and let me just back up one step. CPI is actually 2022 CPI that we get into our 24 taxes. So actual CPI at the end of 22 was 8.5%. So we are capped at 3% as part of this formula that is set by statute. So that will have a little over $1.2 million increase in tax revenue related to CPI. Growth is factored at 3.88%. And just to remind everyone, that is construction growth. That's not market value changes. That's true new growth within the county. That equates to just under 1.6 million. So that's where you get to an increase of just under $2.8 million in total taxes levied.
And that's assuming when you get the opt-out percentage at 24.42%, that's assuming that we don't take any additional opt-out in this next budget cycle.
Correct. So
Okay.
that's assuming consistent opt-out of the 14 million that was currently levied in 2023. We've carried that forward until further discussion with the commission.
Thank you.
Okay. As we go forward, we thought it'd be pertinent to share with you what that tax increase looks like on the levies. So one thing to note, the preliminary abstract values, this number is last year's abstract values that were the final numbers of just $20.7 billion. We don't get that new number till later in the summer. So usually at this time in the conversations, we're using last year's numbers. So just wanted to make sure you were aware of that. So, and we are just showing here on this slide the county levies for county services. It does not include other levies for fire protection, library, the cities, or the schools. It's just county services. And again, assuming opt-outs remain at existing 2023 levels. So the big things that you're seeing here for the increase in taxes that are being proposed would translate to about a $40 increase to a $300,000 home from last year's levies to this year's levies. Building fund levies are fairly consistent, which is with a slight increase of about $3.34. And the bond redemption levy does increase significantly due to the Juvenile Justice Center bond issue that was approved and closed last month. So that levy will go up just over $50. Once the new abstract values go in, we would reevaluate this, and most likely these levies will go down because your values would go up. Any questions before moving on?
Don't see any.
Okay. So diving into the different revenue streams that the county has, you'll see, and I'm going to focus mostly over here on the right side, the 2022 actual through the 24 budget. You'll see an increase of just over 1.4 million in charges for goods and services. There's three main areas that are making that up. One is for juvenile detention center fees. You'll see a significant increase in there. And that is due to the change in methodology that has, the change in methodology for that fee based upon the new building project, as well as that planned increase for 2024 expenses. Additionally, you'll see a decline in registered deeds revenue, as you were briefed earlier this year. They've seen a slowing of services just because of the interest rate market. There's not as many refinancing, so that's been accounted for in the budget to drop that budget slightly to show that slowing in that revenue from the register of deeds. And then as well as we've seen a budgetary increase for the jail of about $700,000 for their border prisoner revenue is the primary target of why that has increased, which are bed rentals. Okay. Intergovernmental revenue, this is where you're seeing the big spikes that you saw on that first overall revenue chart for the COVID relief money and ARPA and South Dakota CARES. Those are going to be anomalies that are not going to necessarily continue as you go through it in other years. And you can see that the budget for 23 and 24 are more in line with historical spending, historical revenue projections. One of the main ones that is in this category that is very unpredictable for us is bank franchise revenue. We do have that budgeted at just over $1.7 million for 2024. That is not one we control. It can vary greatly from year to year. This last year it came in over budget, which was nice to see, but it is something that we just don't control. Okay. So Commissioner Karski, on the miscellaneous revenue side, this is where you're going to see the interest income being represented, and that's on this blue bar here.
Okay.
So we've had a very strong interest income return for 2022, and that's continuing into 23. We've had, we budgeted for 23, $569,000 in interest income, but through the beginning of May, we'd already received $588,000 into the general fund.
Wow.
So we've met budget already for the year, and that's also an indication across all funds, and other funds you're seeing that same interest increase. I'd also like to indicate that what we're also seeing on the other side of the coin is that decrease in register of deeds revenue because of the interest rates. That's a decline. So they kind of balance each other off.
The register of deeds.
The register of deeds. Because they've seen a decline in refinancing because the interest rates are higher on their mortgages, where now we're getting a better return on our cash investments. They kind of balance each other out to a degree, if that makes sense.
Yep.
So as we go into fines and forfeits, these are primarily court-related fines coming through to us through the South Dakota Unified Judicial System. Again, these are not things that we can control. They're very consistent, though, from year to year, and so the budget reflects that. Okay, moving on to license and permits. The one big anomaly for 2022 was the issuance of the cannabis license. That was unbudgeted, and so that did bring in $130,000 a year for that issuance of that license back last year. Going forward, the annual renewal is $30,000 set by our policies. The other main factor in this section is building permits, and those have remained fairly strong last year as well as 2023 year to date. But overall, very little changes in budget from last year to this year. Okay. So when we get into the general fund expenditures, this is a very busy slide, but we kind of wanted to break this down for you so that you can see the overall expenditures in the requested budget. The requested budget for expenditures is just under $85 million for the general fund. Of that amount, 41.4 million, or just under 49% of the budget, is for public safety, which is the sheriff's office, jail, et cetera. And then The other key areas, when you factor in legal services and courts, make up another significant part of our budget. And a large percentage of these expenses that you're seeing in this report are statutorily obligated, meaning those are ones that we have to do. And you will notice for 2022 an increase in health and welfare. Again, that's South Dakota Cares, where we have grant money coming in to pay for those additional expenses.
Say that again. When does that end?
I believe 2025
Okay.
is what we're expecting. But those are dollars that pass to us from the state, so we don't necessarily control.
Except for the 5% we get for administering it.
We do get a reimbursement for payroll costs to administer it, yes.
Thank you.
Okay. High level, just what we've walked through in detail. Requested budget for revenues is just under $79 million, with expenses at just under $85 million, showing a deficit of $6 million. This is very consistent with last year. What you're seeing within these 2024 numbers, just to recap, is opt-out is left at 23 levels. A 5% matrix adjustment is included for all personnel. We've included a 10% health insurance and dental insurance premium increase. New positions are excluded. Outside agencies are budgeted at 23 amounts, and then equipment requests are included. Okay. Diving into the variance between last year to this year for general fund revenues, we're seeing an increase of $4.7 million in general fund revenues. That is made up of these changes here. I won't read them all. We've covered the increase in property taxes, the increase in JDC revenue, about $935,000, a slight increase in property tax revenue, bank franchise tax revenue, and the other one that we've not discussed would be the MacArthur and Air Garter increases from last year. Okay. As we move into the salaries and benefit side of things, our salaries and benefits for general fund are about $58.4 million of our budget. The increase in that category is just over $3.7 million. Of that, just under $2 million is the 5% matrix adjustment, with the step increase of around $735,000. And then the other thing I'll mention that's a little bit different from last year on this would be, with next year being an election year, we have to plan for increased staffing costs related to part-time and overtime for staff to manage the election. So this includes an increase in those categories of $156,500 for that staff. Okay. As we move into other expenditures for the general fund, you'll see non-personnel related expenses is $26.4 million of our budget request. This is just a $719,000 increase from last year's 2023 revised budget number. Strikingly, only $432,000 of that $719 is election related costs that are every other year. The rest of the department expenses are less than $300,000 in variance from last year to this year. The one thing I'll point out that's just a little bit unusual, you'll see the sheriff's office automobile request has a decline of $182,000. That is due to their 2022 carryover into 23. They had to carry over that budget because of supply chain issues. So they're spending more in 23 than they normally would have because of 22 budget issues with supply chain. That makes sense. Okay. As we move into the means of finance, we're just showing you today 5 of the funds on the slide. As we get further into the budget meetings, we'll go into all of the funds. With primarily today being general fund focus as well as highway and building, we didn't want to bring all of the other funds forward and throw too much at you in one time. So this is a form that we do as required by the state, showing our revenue along with interfund transfers. The interfund transfers that you'll see on this slide are going to be over to emergency management. And then on the general fund column, you'll see the 5% of appropriations that's required to be held back by statute, bringing it down to a net means of $74 million, showing appropriations of just under $85 million with interfund transfers of $345,000, with a net cash applied rate of just over $10.6 million for the general fund.
As a percentage.
We'll get to that. Next slide. Over on highway fund, and we'll walk through highway fund in a little bit more detail this afternoon, but again, same concept of the revenue up here, less appropriations, showing a cash applied rate of $766,000. The building fund has property taxes levied in it, so it also has the 5% of appropriation held back, and then appropriations of just under $3.4 million, with showing a surplus of about $1.5 million for the year in the building fund. The main increase in the debt service field is going to be the increase related to the Juvenile Justice Center bond that will end up being levied and paid for out of that bond fund. And then what you're seeing over here in emergency management for revenue is the portion of revenue that we receive for the staffing through the 50% grant that we get for paying for some of those salaries. And then the remainder of the expenses in that fund are paid with general fund transfer. Any questions before we move on?
I'm sure we're all struggling to keep up with you, but we'll ask questions as we come along.
If there's questions or you want me to slow down, just let me know.
I'm willing to wait a little bit if people feel like they want a little more time to absorb it, or we can move on. Okay, I'm looking for some eye contact here from folks. Okay, I think we can move on.
Okay. So this next slide will be the cash applied percentage that Commissioner Karski was interested in. So I might make this a little bigger because it's a little bit harder to see. With the information that you saw on the previous slide, and again, this is general fund only, with that cash applied as is at 10.6 million, we're at a 12.47% cash applied rate. Historically, the county has liked to keep that around 8% to help prevent us from going too far into reserves. So that is considerably higher than where we would normally like to be. What we are showing down here is because we still have ARPA funding available that can cover a number of substantial operating costs. That's what we're seeing down here in this adjustment to appropriation. So we can see what an adjusted cash applied rate is with that funding. So what we're seeing here, I'll just walk through these one by one. If you were to approve all the new positions that Carrie Devers from HR will walk through that have been requested, that's just over $1 million. We do still have capacity within the public sector capacity under the ARPA guidelines to fund all of those with ARPA dollars for 24. So that's why you're seeing an in and an out on that expenditure, because grant funding would pay for that. The next item of just over $1 million that could be covered through South Dakota Cares or ARPA would be rent and utility assistance that Human Services manages. Burials, $300,000. A number of jail-related expenses covering the staff that are in the unit that are holding our inmates that have COVID symptoms, COVID positive, COVID exposure, that we are continuing to have ARPA pay for those. New positions that you have previously approved, could cover about 1.3 million of that. The 2022 salary matrix increase also can be covered by ARPA. That's $2 million approximately. With new outside agency requests could be, if you approved all of the requests that they have given you, would be 278,000. So if you did all of that, factoring that grant money in, that is one-time money, you bring your cash applied right down to just under 6%. I just want to caution that that money will be fully expended in 25, if not sooner. So we have to continue to plan for the expiration of that money. And so just kind of keep that in the back of your mind that this gets us to a successful or satisfied cash applied rate, but that is with one-time money that will be used up in 25.
Yeah, I think we've are aware, and I think we'll have some further discussions, if I'm
Yes.
correct, about, I think last year I used the word chickens coming home to roost, and that's what's coming. All right, Commissioner Karski.
I'm just trying to, in my head, decide which one, are all of these ongoing? Or is it like burials? I mean, we kind of budget for that. I mean, it's funded by ARPA, but are typically all of these going to be ongoing?
Yes.
Year
I would
over
say
year?
that there were, there's a handful of things that were added, new as part of ARPA specifically. The jail added an additional mental health counselor into their work due to the growing mental health challenges, as well as their inmate population increasing. And then juvenile detention center increased psychiatric services out at JDC. So there's a limited amount of things that were added specifically because of ARPA. We've been using ARPA because dollars have been allowed, and these are enumerated uses under the grant. So the column on your right just shows you what your cash applied rate would be if you approved all new positions, all of the outside agency requests, but you did not have that one-time grant funding. So, and that's just there for you to have that comparison. You'd be at about a 13.8% request for cash applied, which is considerably higher than where we would normally like to be.
One more question.
Oh, yes, sorry.
So that's 24. Scare us and tell us what 25 and 26 look like.
As far as their cash applied rate, I think when we get into that forecast piece of our conversations, you can kind of see what some options are of how to manage that. One thing I think we've all had in front of us is just the need to keep property taxes somewhat predictable and avoid spiking. So I think there's some ability that you have as commission to look at ways to do that, to prepare for that money to go away.
Okay, so
All of which involve tax increases, just to be clear.
Okay.
Okay, any other questions? You're doing such a good job presenting that we don't have that many questions. You make it very clear. Thank you.
And I think Carrie's, we're going to jump over to Carrie because before we get into the next section that I'm going to cover is the forecast and cash analysis, but we thought it best for you to hear from Carrie about new position requests and things from her area.
All right.
I don't know where, is her slide in there? Okay. Okay.
Good afternoon, Carrie from Human Resources. Susan's given you an overview of some of the personnel and benefit expenses. This presentation will hopefully give you a sense of what some of those figures are behind that and the reasons that the numbers are in the budget as they currently are. That doesn't mean that they have to stay there. There's, of course, room for adjustments. We thought it might be helpful this year to talk a little bit about staff turnover. You remember a lot of our conversations last year, and the adjustment that was made in April of 2022 stemmed from the fact that we had record levels of turnover that, to my knowledge, the county has never experienced before. Those of you who have watched previous presentations know that the years before this, we tended to average around anywhere between 10 to 12%, upwards of 13% in the last few years prior to 2017 for turnover. So we have had a slight uptick. The reason, of course, for the increases last year was this more than slight uptick that we had at the year end of 2021. When we ended 2021, we had 18% turnover overall. And in quarter one of 2022, we were up to 25%. In fact, January and February were even higher. The good news is by the end of 2022, our overall average did come down to 18%, which shows that some of those adjustments that were made did have the positive effect that we were hoping they would and drastically curb the turnover. Just to give you a comparison by year and point, I think I just mentioned that first quarter 2022 turnover trended at 25% last year. If you compare to our first quarter of 2023, we're now down to 14%. If you were looking May to May, we were at 20% in 2022. I've got 14% here. The good news is it's technically 13.6%, so rounded up. So I'm hoping that's positive news for how the year is going to end. And again, year end is 18%. You might think 2, 3, 4, 5%. How much is that? But the cost of that level of turnover, especially since when you look at a correctional officer position, for example, we train for 2 months or more. Those people don't have value for us until we can get them in a post. That turnover cost is high. All right, so there are several factors you look at each year when you're considering what do you want to move the matrix by, if at all. These are 4 of the main factors that you look at. You look at the consumer price index. You look at employment cost index, which is more of a measure of employment costs and how they're changing nationally. We also look at salary structure increases. A lot of other government entities have a similar compensation approach that we do where they have a pay matrix. They too go through a process where they evaluate each year if they're going to make an adjustment to their pay matrix. So we look at what our comparable entities are doing. This last one, we include the impact of the federal contractors minimum wage and the state minimum wage adjustments because we have a fair number of positions that are within a certain percentage of that minimum wage. So when that minimum wage goes up, it impacts our employees and our ability to recruit. What you're looking at for the CPI data is we can give you year end, of course, for 2021 and 2022. We can tell you what the Social Security is expecting for 2023, or they implemented for an adjustment, and the state minimum wage. But we won't, of course, know what the CPI actually ends for 2023 until the year is over. And that's why those 2 figures are highlighted in gray. What you're seeing with the 5.6 and the 5.4 is an average from January through May. For the employment cost index, same type of situation where we're not going to have year-end data, of course, for 2023 until after the end of the year. So what you're looking at for these 2 figures is measuring first quarter of 2023 back to first quarter of 2022. So what those figures would say is the true cost of labor and recruiting people has increased about 5.1% on the private side. There's been adjustments, state and local government around 4.7. This section is really interesting. This goes to show that similar to Minnehaha County, a lot of our comparable entities have been looking carefully at salaries over the last couple of years and sometimes making some more significant adjustments. This is one of the reasons when we talked about doing a compensation study, we thought it might be better to wait for a year or 2 to allow things to stabilize. I think we're finally getting there. Some of those numbers seem to be more within, a similar range than we've seen previously, for example, in 2022. But you're seeing that while we gave a 5% increase coming into 2023, our comparable government entities gave a 5.21. So we're close, which is good news, particularly since we made the adjustment last year with the additional 7% increase. I think that's been helpful. Other entities that are closest to us, or maybe some of our closest comps, City of Sioux Falls, Lincoln, Pennington County, Metro, and the state, those are the adjustments that they made coming in for 2023. We are, of course, looking at 2024. But all those entities are having the same conversations we are, and we won't know what they're adjusting yet till later in the year, if not even further. The South Dakota state minimum wage, I mentioned we pay attention to that because that can impact our ability to recruit seasonal variable hour employees, and some of our employees may be in the lower pay grades. The state minimum wage, when you consider what it was at last year to 2023, went up 8.54%. Federal contractors' minimum wage went up 8%. Just in case this is catching your eye, the 37% is accurate. There was a significant adjustment made between 2021 and 2022. So looking forward, you can tell that our comps on average gave between 4 to 7.5% coming into 2023, which is right on range with where we moved. We really don't know, again, what they're going to do for the future other than the state of South Dakota, because their fiscal year is July to June, and they're planning for 7% for July. Right now, the payroll budget includes 5%. That is contractually obligated for our union groups. We've included it for the non-union groups. And during these hearings, if you were thinking about an adjustment outside of that range, we would ask for conversation about that, but the 5% is put in for the payroll budget figures currently. Elected officials are one group that are not paid on that pay matrix, so we look at those as a separate group. I'm giving you the same type of data as I have in the past for the elected officials, and it's always a tricky balance. They're paid more on a market-based basis, but because the market data can sometimes swing substantially, you also look at other factors like what do we pay for their chief deputies and what are other department heads making. So just as a recap of what you're looking at here, this first column tells you what these individuals are making in 2023. Or we're also providing you the comp data that we gathered this spring for what the comparable entities are paying for these positions. Again, I want to caution you that when you're setting salaries for next year, we don't know what these entities are doing next year. And also that the salary data that we can gather for these are sometimes can fluctuate fairly significantly. So for the state's attorney, when I contacted our comparable entities, the average salary is $164,125. Some of those entities have salary ranges. Some of them pay flat market, so there is no range. For those that do have a salary range, the average is $133,767 for the state's attorney, with the maximum average of $183,000 plus. And then this midpoint average column tells you the average of the base and the maximum, if there is one. Otherwise, or the midpoint, sorry, between the base and the maximum, if there is one. Otherwise, it's the average salary for those entities. So same process for the sheriff. You can see here for the auditor, treasurer, and register of deeds, we don't have enough entities with an actual base and max to give you an average. There's either 0 or 1 when we go out. And I'll say as a whole for the auditor, treasurer, and register of deeds, a lot of our comps have changed how they handle those positions. Maybe they've combined, or maybe their elected roles include other functions that are outside the scope of what our elected officials do. So the data here is pretty thin. For the commission, you're also looking at budgeting, of course, for yourselves. This is the current salary for this year for everybody but the chair, who earns about $1,000 more. And you can see when we look out at our comparable entities, that average is closer to $41,000. Also provided for you here is where those chief deputies would be for our Minnehaha County employees at the end of the year. So again, I'm trying to give you as close data as I can, 2023 to 2023, but this factors in any step increases the chief deputies would receive by the end of the year. It does not reflect, of course, any increase that they would receive for 2024, so something to keep in mind. Also for the elected officials, I think it's helpful for you to get a sense of where your elected officials are paid in comparison to your appointed staff, and this gives you that information. Same type of thing, I'm giving you salaries at the end of 2023 so you can get a closer comparison, knowing, of course, that your appointed department heads would be receiving an adjustment for 2024. Any questions on the elected official data? Okay. Moving on, Susan shared that we've budgeted for a 10% increase on the health and dental. Again, many of you probably remember that we went through a bump a few years ago. I would say it was maybe more than a bump, where we had a significant increase in our health plan costs. We've been pretty conservative with how we budget since then. 8% would probably be the lowest I'd ever feel comfortable budgeting for a health and dental insurance increase. We've gone as high as 15% in recent years, and that's all because of this trend that we experienced. The good news is claims are trending well for this year. It may look like we had a low year in 2022. You can see that our total cost of operating our health and dental plans went down in 2022. That is partially due to the fact that we had a claim lag, and some of the claims from 2022 didn't clear until early 2023. So that number, I would say, is somewhat low. I would say this has also maybe had an impact on our $7.6 million for the annualized costs that we'd be expecting for this year. Very honestly, I'm hopeful that we have a good year, but when we asked to budget this in April, May timeframe, it's very difficult to predict what the next few months can come up with. So we put in the 10%, but again, we're trending well. This reserve balance has been going up. Based on my calculations, I'm shooting for that to stay closer to 4.2 for the year, so we're over, but maybe ideally we would need. We've held off on coming and talking about premium holidays because we knew we had this claim like that needs to clear. As soon as we're sure that everything's come through, I will likely be before you making a request. So that's the good news on the health side.
Madam Chair, just one question. You say a reserve balance target around 4.2 is, what's the objective basis in that, or what is our target
Good
for
question.
reserve?
What we look at is our trending and what we anticipate claims to be. So every year, at the beginning of the year, we take a look back and we project what we anticipate for the claims to be for the upcoming year. The short answer is that tends to be, I'm fairly conservative, that tends to be about half a year's operating costs. So a very good reserve. Staffing requests, you'll probably recall that a few years ago we started breaking these out for you so that you see the grant-funded positions. This year there's only one currently existing grant-funded position to talk about, and that's the diversion coordinator in the state's attorney's office. Good news, since these slides were put together, we knew that there was a potential that that grant funding would end for the full year of 2024. We have been informed that the grant has been renewed through September of 2024. So when we update figures, or when Susan puts those together, we'll make that adjustment for the next round. However, it's still something that you'll want to discuss whether or not you want to fund with the general fund money starting September of next year, technically October of 2024. The new position requests this year, Susan mentioned that we're looking at about $1 million on total claim or total cost for positions. This is the list of the departments that requested a position and the title of the position which they're requesting. This gives you an idea of the pay grade for the position, since that drives a lot of the cost. And the FTE column indicates the number of new positions that they're requesting for in that title or that classification. So we have the Equalization Office requesting 1 appraiser in training, and this is the total cost of the request for the year. Public Advocate's Office is requesting a legal office assistant. Public Defender is requesting both an investigator and a social worker. The State's Attorney's Office is requesting a deputy state's attorney. And then here's where it changes slightly. The jail is planning for expansion of Unit Control 3. These costs are highlighted in blue for you because they're planning upcoming changes in staffing, but they think they can delay those changes in staffing until at least middle of next year. So this is the cost per position on an annualized basis, but because they're looking at filling it for a half year only, the total 2024 annualized cost is only around $500,000. They're also requesting 2 corporals, again for half year only, at a total cost of around $90,000. In addition to that, the treasurer's office was requesting a tax and license technician. This goes back to a full year request at 68. And that's where you're getting the $1 million total cost for 2024. But again, the total annualized cost would be higher if we were filling them for a full year. Any questions?
Any questions for Carrie? All right, I anticipate we'll be revisiting some of that information probably at a different date. Commissioner?
Chairman?
Yes.
If I could ask our HR director to be put on the spot for a minute, because I didn't
Sure.
think about this earlier.
Okay.
Maybe this, since we've got a few minutes here, extra, might be a time for you to talk about salary study,
Sure.
and especially since we have some new commissioners.
Okay. You might have noticed on one of Susan's previous slides, when she was talking about the increase in expenditures, there was about 108,000, I believe, in the HR budget under professional services. That is because we're budgeting to do the classification and compensation study. You might recall that we talked about this a couple of years ago, and we had budgeted to complete it in 2022. At that time, that's when we were experiencing that 25% turnover. We knew that we had to respond quickly. And so we looked at our data, we did an internal review, and that's what drove the request to the commission for the adjustments that were approved last year. I think I mentioned that a lot of the other entities have been going through similar processes and similar adjustments. We wanted to wait until things stabilized before we would do another classification and compensation study. So we're still planning to do that, but we wanted everything to adjust before we did it. So the 108 that's being budgeted is in the hopes that we can start that study at the end of 2024 and have data ready in 2025.
Any questions about that? I know I've had an opportunity to talk to Carrie about it, but sometimes I forget who else has had that same opportunity. So I think it's prudent, makes sense, so.
It's a good opportunity now that things are somewhat stabilizing to get a really good measure of how we compare and our salary and benefits competitive. So looking forward to doing that. Thank you.
All right, any other questions? So I note on our schedule that we're supposed to do a break at this point. And I guess I'm open to ideas. We could either have a couple more presentations, we could take a shorter break and then dive into the remainder of the agenda. Any strong preferences one way or the other? Okay. I'd be in favor of taking a 10-minute break at this point and then coming back and diving in. I don't know if there was some magic to the 20 minutes that I'm missing. Okay, I'm not seeing any. All right, so I think we adjourn for 10 minutes, give people a chance to stretch their legs a little bit, and then we will dive into the remainder of our agenda for today. Thank you. All right, so we're starting the 120 part of our presentation at 12:43. So we're already successful.
Okay,
back to
so
you, Susan.
this is a new part of our presentation today that we have added from our normal presentation in prior years. And this came out of a conversation and a recommendation from the FAN committee about not just focusing on the next budget year, but looking at the long-term view so that commissioners can plan ahead and know kind of what the vision of the future looks like. So just to start with just some background information on how these forecasts are prepared. You're going to see, we have them in graph form. So if at any point in a future meeting you want to see like flat out numbers, I'm a numbers person, but I know not everybody wants to see raw numbers everywhere. So this is a graph form. If you want to see it in a different way, let me know and we can have that be a part of a future conversation. So first we're going to start with just showing you 2019 through 2022 actual information. 23 is revised budget, and then 24 is the requested budget field. And then we have different scenarios that will play out to you as part of this. So 25 through 29 is a forecasted budget. So what that means is we have assumptions for growth, CPI, matrix opt-out increases, and cash applied factors. These are all assumptions and estimates. I would love to tell you that they're all 100% correct, but we also know that I can't predict the future, so I have no idea what inflation and growth and everything will play out to be. And then this also assumes that ARPA and South Dakota CARES funding remains available through 25 based upon what we currently know. So just know that that's layered into this for the next 2 years. So as we go through this, we're going to show you 4 different scenarios as far as the forecast goes. The first one will just be 24 requested budget. No new positions, no UC3 expansion. And then the second one will be 24 requested budget with that unit control 3 expansion included. The third scenario will be 24 budget, UC3 expansion, and then 250,000 of positions annually throughout 2029. And then 2024 will be all of that plus $500,000 annually in new positions. Just to kind of give you an idea of how these different scenarios will look as the future goes on. And I'm going to point on this slide, I have it on all of them, future results are going to vary from this because again, I can't predict the future. So what you're going to see over here, just to kind of show you, the blue bar is our revenue. The orange bar are our expenses. The green bar is opt-out, so you can kind of see where the opt-out is in comparison to total as you go forward. And then this blue bar, the blue line, is going to be our cash. So focusing on 2024, right here, this is our requested budget. And you can see revenue and total expenditures are lined up right here. As we've kind of planned and talked about in previous years, we know there's potentially like a 3% variance to total expenses on a given year where we have a savings. That's been factored into this with our normal 8% cash applied target, just to keep that in line. So what you can see here, every year, it just keeps going up for revenue and expenses. And what we have here on opt-out is just the continual need to have an increase in opt-out as we go. My goal with keeping cash was trying to keep the cash somewhat level. And as what you can see here in 24 and 25, you'll see a slight increase in cash as we're trying to plan and prepare for that opt-out so that we can level that opt-out in to not have huge spikes in opt-out in 26 when that ARPA funding expires. So I think it might help if I go to the next slide. I couldn't fit this all into one slide, so that's why you're going to see the second page here that shows you your assumptions. The top 5 lines are the same on every scenario. So what I'm planning for inflation for 25 is 4.5%. That's the current inflationary rate for the last 12 months. That's the best data I had. Obviously, we don't know what will happen in the remainder of the year, but that's what we have in this forecast. And then I just have it incrementing down through the end of the forecast. And then growth, we know that our current growth for 2024 is 3.88%, and then 3.2%, 3%, and then again incrementing it down. I looked at the last 15 years of growth rate. There's been years that go above the 3%, but then they kind of level back off under 3%. So again, this is the best data I had with what history has shown us. Maybe the future will show higher growth rate. and we can play with these assumptions based upon things that you'd like to see different as we go forward. Group insurance, again, just different percentages between 10 and 8% throughout the life of this forecast, based upon where we've seen that historically. For the matrix increase for payroll, the 5% that we have discussed already for 2024, the union contracts for 25 show a 3%, so we have that built in for 2025. And then because 26 through 29 is unknown, I have those matrices at 1.5%. Again, just an estimate to have something in there. And then the 10%, the step increase of 2.5% throughout the cycle of the forecast. So you'll see I have this yellow bar shaded for a cash applied target. So we traditionally like to keep that at 8%, just to try to not dip into reserves too far. What you'll see here is I've lowered that cash applied target to 5% over the next couple of years to try to keep that opt-out smooth, to keep things from going too far, too much in one single year, to try to keep that predictable for the taxpayers. What you'll see here, the existing opt-out is the opt-out of $14 million that we've previously taken, and that's in the forecast. This existing opt-out new, that is the opt-out that you have currently already authorized, that we have $2.1 million left. So this line here totals $2.1 million. And then what you'll see in 2027, that $1.625 million opt-out, that's expiring. And so this new opt-out needed would require commission action to pass a new opt-out. So with this scenario, no new positions, no unit control 3 expansion, estimates would show about a $5 million new opt-out needed through 2029 to maintain cash levels at a current level through 29.
Yes, Commissioner Karski.
So if we're talking about opt-outs needed, would this be the right time to discuss, looking 5 years ahead, what kind, instead of taking, like we've historically done, but doing what the Financial Action Committee recommended, incrementally putting those opt-outs in, even though we don't need it, but just to kind of build that piggy bank for two reasons. One, we don't take a big one, and two, we don't know what we don't know as far as what could happen. So if we were to level that out over 5 years, what type of opt-out should we be taking annually for the next 5 years?
So in this scenario, it would be, I'd say around that 1.2 to 1.5 mark to get that balance through. The existing opt-out in this scenario would get you through 25, and then would level that out into 26. And what you can see here in 26, 27, and 28, I've bumped up that cash applied target above 8%, trying to use up some of those dollars that we received earlier so that we can, again, level that out for the taxpayer.
And I think some of these next slides, which probably in my mind can contain more realistic assumptions, help bring that home even more. Because this has no new positions. That's not a realistic scenario in my mind, so.
Yeah, this just really shows you level set where we are today. If nothing changes and we keep in a vacuum, where we're going to be once those one-time dollars expire. Okay. So moving on, again, same slide, same scenario. Again, trying to keep that cash around that 35 million mark. This includes just unit control 3 expansion. Carrie spoke about the request for 24 positions. The overall UC3 expansion is going to really encompass between 24 through 28. A total of 14 positions that's requested for 24, an additional 13 new requests for 25. It'll also include increase in jail medical costs, food costs, as you have your inmate costs. Those will be incorporated. Those are incorporated in here. It also incorporates 18 new FTEs for a mid-year hire in 27. for the third phase of UC3 expansion.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Commissioner Karski.
Made a comment, I just want to make sure I'm understanding of keeping the cash reserves at 30 million. Aren't we trying to target like 20 or 25%?
So part of that is going to factor into the formula of how, at the end of the year, we are required to put next year's cash applied balance into an assigned fund balance category. So our unassigned fund balance then dips below that. So if you have 35 million in cash in your general fund, but 10 of that's assigned, only 25 million is unassigned fund balance. And so that was the threshold that that unassigned fund balance is the comment that the analysts indicated that they would look at as a metric. We need further dialogue in the long term as far as what that threshold should be for Minnehaha County. For purposes of this, I've just left it kind of in that 35 million mark in total as you get out to 29.
Okay.
That all is part of the assumptions that are built in here and can be changed and modified as we discuss.
Okay.
So when you look at the UC3 expansion numbers, that includes the full usage of UC3 in 2028 for a total of 148 beds.
So all of those positions that you described, the 14, 13, and 18, over those years are all built into this?
They are all built in there, including increase in medical costs, including food costs. By the time you get into 2028, that cost is roughly $4.7 million in total. We've also built in additional revenue for an increase in bed rentals. Again, that's all very high-level estimates based upon unknowns of availability of beds. But we tried to factor that in because we know there's going to be some capacity for additional bed rentals as those floors or that unit becomes fully available. Okay. So as you go into the next slide where you look at opt-out and what that looks like, again, trying to keep overall these numbers to be for opt-outs to be less than 2 million for a new year. Again, you can see some adjustments in the cash applied target percentages from the previous slide. This shows with UC3 expansion a need of new opt-outs of just under $8 million. And the usage of the cash applied target, those would be things that every year we're going to have to analyze where our cash is at to see what is feasible. There's a lot of dollars that we get that we don't control. Bank franchise is a great number as an example. We don't control that number. It could be, there's been some years that was 1.5 million and the next year it was $1 million less.
And I guess to Commissioner Karski's point earlier, to me, this provides a little better illustration of how we may choose to manage our opt-out in order to smooth out taxes, just because it provides a more dramatic picture, I think. That in order to spread out and level out tax increases, which was the recommendation of the FAN and which is my personal recommendation, I'd rather have it spread out. It requires us to take opt-out earlier and spread it out. Commissioner, or Carol.
I think, we'll see if I can get this right or not, Susan, if I'm running numbers in my head. Susan has already done some of the smoothing out that we've looked at. If she had not done that smoothing out of doing a 3% cash applied and then a couple years of that and then jump it up to 10 and then bring it back to 8, which is where our target is at. This green line is opt-out, correct, Susan?
Correct.
Okay. So
Carol?
if you didn't have that smoothing out happening, what you'd see is this going along and then it would go like that, correct?
Right.
That's
We
what you'd
wouldn't have
see.
the nice incremental.
It would go like this and then jump. Does that make sense to you? That's what, and when I'm hearing the questions and we're talking about it, then I start to realize, well, we could have done a slide on, but we didn't think about doing it that way. But if that makes sense and helps, so it's a gradual increase in there?
You ultimately are going to end up at the same place for the amount of opt-out you need. It's just the mechanism and the timing of which you get there. The expenses are going to be there. It's just the timing of how you bring in that opt-out to smooth that out.
And then
Commissioner
if I
Kickley.
could add a thought in there, I think what I was hearing from Commissioner Karski was if there was, this concept that came up in the fan was this laddering effect. So maybe in year one, $1 million opt-out, year two, $1.2 million, $1.4 million, $1 million. So it's always just kind of ratcheting it up. And I think that would work, but I think maybe if you go to the next slide, I think the 1.6 million coming off kind of throws a little wrench in that plan, but looking at it graphically, it is smooth, so
Right.
it has that same effect. I'd have to maybe spend some more time with the numbers to see if there's a way to do that, but I think that was some feedback from the Sioux Falls School District of, if you recall that, Commissioner Karski, about that. I think they just make it part of their annual budgeting process is just ratchet up. They opt out every year and just ratchet it up. So again, if it's back to being predictable and whatnot, that's one method. I think this probably accomplishes the same thing. So maybe it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, but just as we're thinking this through, I think it's worth the dialogue.
I mean, you do have that ability to pass one, and what was done the last time an opt-out was passed in 2019, a larger opt-out, and then we've layered it in when needed. And then the opt-outs previous to that in 2006, 2012, and 2015, the opt-outs were passed and then fully used in that next year. So there are different methods to do it. It really is going to come down to what you as a commission want to see. And if you want that to be an annual conversation, that we have that, or if you want it to be one conversation over and have it try to last for 5 years. Those are probably part of your things that you have to consider.
$6 million at once or $1.5 million over 4 years? Knowing you don't use the full $6 million at once, you spread it out over 4 years.
Correct.
It's just a little more of a bitter pill to take.
So the next scenario we have is UC3 expansion included, and then we've included $250,000 annually of new positions, which are roughly half of the positions that you've been asked, that have been requested. The thing I'd like to just point out with $250,000, it doesn't get you as far as it used to. $250,000 is essentially 2 attorney positions. So just to kind of keep that in mind as you go forward of where that would get you in the term of requests, just keep that in mind. So again, 250,000 of new positions is the variance here. I have increased that for inflation as we go through the future years, so that does increase slightly as we go through the slides. Again, keeping that cash around that 35 million. This one, it shows a little bit under that 35 million mark. But as you go down into what I know you're interested in is what that is an opt-out. Just under $9.8 million in new opt-out would be needed to accomplish that. Again, trying to keep your opt-outs under 2 million a year. These are inching up a little bit higher, closer to that 2 million mark. You'll see 1.5 for 2024, about 1.9 for 2025, 2 million for 2026 as you go through this. And again, a little bit of changing with your cash applied targets, just to trying to smooth those in to keep them under that 2 million mark. So just about $2 million more in opt-out over the course of this. Okay. And then finally, the fourth scenario is what this would look like with $500,000 in new positions. And that is all of the new positions that you have in front of you for this year, then layered in for every year since, as you go forward through 29, $500,000 of new positions every year. Again, cash still under that 35 million mark. This time though, your opt-out is exceeding $26 million in this scenario. And then as you go through this, here you're inching up in some of these scenarios over 2 million. When you get into 2026, it's 2.3 million. In some of the other years, it's 2.2. So impact is about 11.5 million in opt-out through 29 in this scenario. And as I've indicated, and I'll stress again, these are just an assumption and a forecast based upon the inflationary factors and growth factors that we had in here. I wish I could tell you that it was known numbers, but I don't have a crystal ball. So just to kind of give you a general idea of what this looks like.
Questions? I think the moral of the story is that this year's budget is a piece of cake compared to the coming budgets, what we're looking at, so.
Okay. And then maybe just some highlight the fiscal challenges that we've identified in these. And these are all things I know you already know, but we're going to just highlight them just for purpose of conversation. Just the need for expansion into UC3 to meet the needs of a growing jail. We know that that's going to happen. It's just a matter of how soon that's going to be needed. We also know that we have continuing staffing needs to address our growing county. Primarily, those are often in public safety related positions of sheriff's office, state's attorney, public defense, and the public defender and public advocate's office. We know that we need to be very prudent with our cash management in the future as we adjust to the expiring of the grant money, because we need to make sure that we keep that cash applied balance at a level that is reasonable to maintain our bond rating for future issuances. And then fourth, the statute that requires the cap on CPI at 3% does have an impact these last 2 years with the inflation factor that was over 3%.
Commissioner Karski.
I just want to pick on the sheriff's office for a little bit, if I could. You know, the UC3, the increased expenses, I mean, are we anticipating revenues to stay flat where they are, or that are revenues going to go up with that?
Good afternoon, Mike Mattson, Warden of the Jail. No, we are forecasting that with the additional beds that we will be able to have additional beds to rent. So the Board of Prisoners revenue line will increase with those beds that become available because we're occupying some new space.
So is there a way to see, Susan, the net impact? I mean, we're talking about raising the expenses for the jail by X, but that really doesn't factor in the revenue increase.
The revenue increases are factored into that forecast.
There, as a total, but not maybe as an offset to what just that one line item is.
I don't have a slide for you today. We do have something just in case you wanted to see more detailed information about UC3 for next Tuesday. We do have something that would show you the
Okay.
phases and the potential revenue by year, if that's something you want to see.
I'd
next
like
week.
to see it. I think it's important for the public to know, hey, yeah, we're increasing the jail expenses, but we're also increasing that revenue, and it's not a total impact of, $1 million annualized. It might be only, I don't know what that number is, and that's what I'd like to see.
And just to piggyback on that, I do get a report every week that shows where we are in the jail and the different kinds of population. And I think the monthly report went out to commissioners.
So
And it does show that, in my mind, the jail does really manage the open beds and tries to make sure that there aren't, because the jail has there are always lots of people looking for beds, unfortunately. Not necessarily a great commentary on our society, but it is the truth. And so that's a really good point, just to help people understand that.
yeah, we're always picking on public safety in the jail maybe, but we're not really showing that full transparency, the net impact.
There's
It's
a
just
need there, but that it's really well managed, I think, is the story there.
Yep.
So,
Thank you.
So just moving on, we thought it was important to highlight the CPI cap and kind of what it means in terms of these last 2 years where inflation has been very high. So I was able to obtain actual CPI from the state for 2011 through 2024. And so the slide that you have up right now just shows you the CPI that was included in the property tax calculations by year. So the blue bar is what we use for calculation of property taxes. So for 2019 through 2022, they were the same. 2023, we had, you can see that, you guys don't see that on here, it's on my copy. For 2023, we had a cap of 3% for CPI. The actual that I received from the state that they show was actual was 5.3%. And then for 2024, we have a cap of 3%. The actual was 8.5%. So, and like I indicated earlier in our meeting, that 2024 impact of the cap, that's really actually the CPI from 2022. So there is that lag and when it rolls into your property tax calculations. So we were curious what it would be, what the impact on property taxes would be if there was no cap. If we were able to charge actual CPI as you go through. So this next slide tries to show that. And again, this is an estimate. This is my estimate. And just all to point out, this is the impact on both general fund and building fund combined. So we've had, based upon our notes, we've hit that cap of 3% for CPI 7 times since the early 2000s. The majority of them, the 4 years in the early 2000 to 2010, I was not able to obtain that actual percentage by the state. So we estimated that off of the Bureau of Labor and Statistics website. So no, there could be some variance to actual on those numbers. So what happens is when you hit that cap, you don't get that money in that current year for CPI, but then that rolls forward to the next year because that's not in your new base. So it has this compounding effect as you go forward in subsequent years. So as you go forward, starting in 2023, that impact on that cap was about $1.8 million for just 23. And you can see in those prior years, because those inflation wasn't very high over 3%, we're estimating it was under $800,000 annually prior to that. And then every year it just kind of increments up a little bit because you're not getting growth in CPI on that base. That makes sense? And then with 2024, the CPI being actually 8.5%, it jumps up to over $4 million impact for 2024.
Questions on that? They're real numbers.
So we know this is a little bit confusing, and so what we thought maybe it would be good is just to show you how that calculation happens. And we're using 2023 tax information here. So we had base taxes in the original calculation for 23 of just over $41 million. So we got CPI of 3%, which was 1.2 million. And then we got growth of 3.2, which was equated to 1.3 million. So we had property taxes levied of a base of $43.9 million. So this is before, the opt-out is nowhere in this conversation. So if we were to have been able to include that actual CPI in prior years, we would have started the year with a base of 42.1 million. So that's where 782,000 of that difference comes to be. Then if you have actual CPI of 5.3, it would have been 2.2 million, or $992,000 difference from actual, what we were originally able to charge. And although growth has no impact on CPI, because your base was lower, that had a $25,000 effect. So that's where you get to that 1 year impact of 1.8 million for 2023. And so There's nothing any one of us in this room can do about the cap, but we thought it was very important to highlight the impact of that cap because our expenses in 22 and 23 have increased with inflation, which we've seen with the matrix increases. And so that's also plays into the need for the opt-out conversations.
Commissioner Karski.
I think it's a great argument, Susan, when you look at how quickly things can change for doing that layered in opt-out, even though you don't need it, because in 1 year you can get hit with a very greater than you want to take. So, I mean, it just makes sense, and I think it's a great argument to layer in that opt-out.
And the other thing I'd like to just remind you with opt-out, and we've talked about this before, is opt-out does not get growth in CPI. So when you pass an opt-out to pay for ongoing expenses, you need it for $1 million in staffing. The next year, there's inflationary factors on your expenses, but not on your revenue. So you're already falling behind the next year.
Yep, and a 3% inflation rate in 20 years, it's half the value.
So we just thought it was important to show you this because this is one of our challenges that's impacting the financials.
Commissioner Kipley.
I think that was some of the feedback within the fan. I'm thinking again of our friends at Sioux Falls School District of layering up opt-outs like 1 million 1 year, 1.2. Basically, they take into the account an inflationary effect of their own opt-outs. And while I think some of this might be a broader critique of and probably be part of the discussion with the state legislature's county summer study and whatnot, part of me still says we, at the end of the day, have the local control to make up these differences with the opt-outs and do some creative things with the opt-outs. I wanted to take you back to your fiscal challenges identified.
Yes.
And maybe you could just embed this into these different forecasts as just one other line item to talk about the when you're talking about prudent cash management and reserves. I don't know, maybe it's just as easy as, because you know the formula better than I do of what counts as reserves and what's in that numerator and denominator, because if something's applied funding from the prior year, it doesn't count and whatnot. Yep. But if $35 million in the numerator is kind of a magic number, what is that denominator? And just maybe help me understand if you want to walk through that once, but maybe in future documents we could just put what percent is in reserves at the end of that year to see if we're over some period of time, are we meeting a 25% reserve?
Yep, I can do that. And if that's the threshold, we just would like, as for sake of discussion, we can do that for 25%.
Yeah, I think that's a good first step just for discussion purposes to see, because I think if you kind of have a cash applied target historically trying to be 8%, but then what effect does that have on, if that's meant to be a number that has kind of a net neutral effect on reserves, what are some other scenarios we could see in the short term? Do we need to dip into those reserves to make up for the fact that we're losing out on the federal money? So there's some trade-offs in there that I think we need to make an informed judgment on, and I think you've done a good job of laying out the cash applied target in these scenarios, but maybe giving us what that means for the reserves within the spreadsheet rather than just the graphical form.
Certainly, we can do that.
Thank you.
And then just maybe in conclusion, just our concluding thoughts. 2024 requested budget is a deliverable budget, but with ARPA funding provided much needed financial support. It is going to continue to be imperative that we plan for the expiration of that funding in 2025. And then the second bullet point is just talking through the opt-outs, that opt-outs will continue to be necessary to maintain current levels of service, not expanding service or levels of service, just to maintain current service levels. And just the comment about the timing and the amount of those, as you've discussed, one larger opt-out, annual smaller opt-outs will be important. Third point is just that our challenges to our growing county, we need to meet them with a thoughtful strategic cash management and fiscal management approach to plan for this. And then finally, we think it's important that we continue to tell our story at the state level, as well as to the taxpayers of Minnehaha County, what the fiscal challenges we are facing as we look at needing more opt-outs down the road.
Questions for Susan? Certainly provided a lot of food for thought. It's very well done, I think, so.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, so that takes us to requests and considerations. Carol Muller.
You know where that slide is, Carol?
Somewhere in here.
The top, maybe?
Nope.
This is Carrie. This is Tyler. Not there.
Okay, could we take a 10-minute break while we
We
get
certainly
this
can. We
figured
will
out?
reconvene at 1:30.
Okay.
Thank you. Fix our technical difficulties.
Trying to get through, I'm so sorry. Oh, you. I got that.
'24 preliminary budget. Other requests. Carol.
Good morning, Commissioners. Carol Muller. And before you right now is looking at the mix of a lot of other stuff that you get asked about. Starting off first, talking about vehicles and equipment requests. Equalization is asking for one vehicle. If they were approved for that new position, they would need to have a vehicle to go with that. Facilities is replacing out, how old a pickup, Mark? Okay, 1999, yes. Well used during that time. The sheriff's office does a great job of recognizing that they have a lot of vehicles, so they have a schedule where they go through and replace during this time. And what they would do is replace 2 investigator vehicles and 6 patrol SUVs. Those vehicles, of course, come with lights and decals and all kinds of equipment inside of them that a regular vehicle doesn't have, so that's why you see the vehicle equipment that's up there. The additional is a emergency management vehicle for rescue squad, $43,000. I would just point out that that emergency management fund is funded through general funds. So there's no magical amount of money that drops in doing that. And
An additional vehicle, a new
Jason,
replacement?
you want to just explain a second? I'll invite him up and let him explain a minute.
It's not an additional vehicle. They'll be surplusing a older Suburban. I think it's a 2004 Suburban, 3/4 ton. And the intention is Doug Blomker is possibly going to retire in December area. And the idea is to transfer a sheriff's sergeant out to that and have more of a patrol vehicle for him so he can do functions in patrol and training and emergency management.
Where'd you get the 04? Was that new to you, or was that
That's been there since.
Long time?
Since
Okay.
before I was there, and I'm guessing it with that year, I'm guessing it came from a grant maybe, because there was a lot of grant funding back at that time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. And then the longer list always comes from the highway department, and I've asked Steve Groen, highway superintendent, to join us at this time and take us through the list of items that he has. See if I can bring this all up on one screen. There you go, Steve.
Close. Good afternoon, Steve Groen, Highway Superintendent. All but, oops, I hit a button.
As you say.
There you go. All but two of these units are replacement items. Right now, as you saw earlier on the highway fund, we're sitting really good on our cash basis. And we were working with Joe, and I talked with Gene earlier before Joe became our liaison. This last winter really showed us the value of having operable equipment. Our snow blowers were old, they were down quite often. We didn't have a bulldozer, which my predecessor had sold a few years ago. There was a couple instances last year where it would have come in handy. We were really surprised when we needed one this winter how much a rental dozer costs. It was almost $10,000 for 4 weeks, but for those 4 weeks, we could only use it for 80 hours. So in effect, it was $10,000 for basically 2 weeks worth of work. So we were going through our numbers for this year, and we figured this is with the way the revenues have been the last few years, with the growth of the county and the license fees and stuff, we had basically a once in a generation opportunity to replace some of the older equipment that we use most years, but not every year, like the snow blowers, our side dump trailers that are very critical, that are 20 years old. And we started replacing our 6-wheel drive dump trucks that are the old style Sterlings that we only use in really bad weather. The new 6x6s are built a lot differently where you can use them regularly. So why have two 6x6s that are used sparingly that could be cycled into a regular snowplow rotation and take the place of two of our snowplows? The new equipment on here that's not replacement is a crack sealing trailer. It's something we've been wanting to do for a few years, is to bring crack sealing in-house. We have the capabilities to do that. Then we don't have to hire contractors to do that work. We're in more control. Plus, at my previous position, you can do crack sealing in other times of the year. If you're having a mild winter, you could have your crews out there doing crack sealing in the wintertime. So if any of these items in particular you want more information, I'd be happy to go through them with you.
I have questions.
Yes,
Surprise.
Commissioner Karski, sorry.
And so, in the last 4 years, you've used a dozer. You needed it for 2 weeks. I mean, what's the life expectancy? You'd have to really do a lot of convincing for me to want to buy a $200,000 dozer.
We have a gravel pit that would be used for some projects out there, but one of the big issues we have, one of the big ticket items for the Highway 149 project heading south of Colton is our inslopes, our shoulders coming off our roads. We basically have a lot of roads with no shoulders and unrecoverable slopes coming off the shoulders. That's something that we're able to get material quite often from the city of Sioux Falls when they're dredging Skunk Creek. And last year we got 25,000 yards of materials from them that we were able to crush into some really good usable material. That material we're going to use on Highway 149 and have the contractor place it next year. We can continue to get that material. That is something that I would like our crews to do in-house, is we can start knocking off a few miles a year in-house, adjusting our inslopes to make our roads safer. And one of the key pieces of equipment you would need to do that work would be a dozer.
So what would have we paid a contractor for that few miles a year of road that you'd be doing? What would have that cost to the county been?
Well, the original cost for Colton, next year we have, basically it's just the inslopes. Excuse me. In our 24 budget, most of it's going to be inslopes next year for 5 miles, and it's $2 million.
That you could have done, or could do in-house, given
Could
the
do
equipment? Okay, okay.
There'd be manpower and other, that's 5 miles is a long stretch. The cost would have been substantially more by having them bring material in. But it'd be quite a cost saving to do it in-house.
Okay, okay. One more? So a few weeks ago, you somewhat volunteered to work a little bit with the vehicles, and we had an issue with the vehicle that was purchased. Maybe somebody else up here is a vehicle expert. I bought my last vehicle 12 years ago. So when we talk about a 2004 Chevy 3/4 ton Suburban, is there a way, or would you, or mechanic shop, your department, have a way of just saying, yeah, this thing just isn't worth putting more money into it anymore?
Yeah, pretty much. That's part of the reason we replace vehicles regularly. Take, for example, the 2024 F-550 you see on top. That's replacing the 2004 F-250. And you get to that 10-year point, we like to go 10 years, 150,000 miles at the highway department. You start getting the rust issues. Facility just came a couple weeks ago with a truck that was in the shop, had broken body mounts. They were rusted out, completely shot. If you're doing in-house maintenance, you have your full-time mechanics doing preventive maintenance on there and keeping track on stuff. Those mechanics can advise the other departments on, hey, this vehicle is shot, or you got a leaking CV joint, for example, was one we heard of recently. It's cost this much to fix. We could do it in-house, save you X number of dollars. Might want to consider. But we look at our vehicle maintenance costs as part of our replacement program. And we could have a newer vehicle that has a lot of maintenance issues, and we could just decide, hey, next year's budget, this really should be a candidate for being replaced. Some 2004 Suburbans can be just fine if they're properly maintained and don't have the rust issues. Each vehicle is independent.
And I guess that's my question. I mean, it's just kind of that second set of eyes from a professional that's in-house that could look at
Right.
that and say, yeah, it's time for this one to be replaced.
Correct.
Instead of saying, well, it's 19 years old and has 135,000 miles on it, or 240,000, whatever it is, so.
Correct.
Yeah.
It's part of the reason we try to keep our snow plows going about every 9 years. That seems to be the sweet spot with rust and mechanical issues and the availability to get parts. A couple of these trucks on here for this year, we're replacing Sterlings. They haven't made Sterlings for 6 or 7 years. You can't even get parts for them anymore. So that's something we look at too as we're looking at vehicles. How easy is it to get the parts if you have to do replacements?
Okay.
Should we get the PowerPoint? Or?
I didn't do the PowerPoint, they just have to hand out.
Okay.
Yeah, Commissioner Bleinberg.
Just a question regarding the request. Is this typical? Do you see this kind of request every year? I know you said the dozer was obviously a unique purchase, but
We're doing more this year than previous years. We decided after last winter our snow blowers were down quite a bit. That was another critical piece. We have 2 new front end loaders we got last year. We'd like to get new blowers to attach to those. The new equipment isn't set up for the old wiring harnesses that the old loaders had for hooking your blowers up. But now there's Bluetooth wireless controllers, makes operating and hooking up and unhooking your snow blowers way more efficient and safer. And after the last winter, when we looked at where we're at with the highway fund, we made a decision in-house. It was time to get some new equipment that we use every other year, sometimes 2 out of 3 years, but now was the time to get. We saw last year was an unusual winter. We saw what a beating our equipment can take when we have really hard winters last year.
so the request next year, you wouldn't anticipate being
No,
like this?
I'd have to look to see what my 23 number was for this year, but it wasn't almost $2 million.
Okay,
This is, I think we're about 600,000 over what our normal ask is for 24.
and being new to the request process, is it fair to ask for maybe your priorities or which ones wouldn't be as significant for the next year?
Well, odds are that we're gonna have a hard time getting 2 plow trucks next year. We had 2 for this year's budget, and we've only been able to get 1 build slot from Freightliner this year. We're looking at options on maybe doing leasing instead. We had 2 snow plows in our budget last year that we ordered in April of '22. We've had the chassis in our possession since October of last year, and we still have not had our build slots that were originally supposed to have been last year. We're still sitting on the chassis waiting for the factory to say we're ready to do the builds. So there's a chance that some of those wouldn't come to fruition next year, but hopefully it'd be the following year. So right now, we're gonna be, if we don't get our 2 builds for the trucks that were approved for last year, we're using 11-year-old plows, and we'd like to replace them after 9. So outside of that, maybe the crack sealer, but then we're just hiring a contractor to continue doing that work. The tenant sweeper for $75,000, our shop is brand new and it's really big, and we don't have a scrubber. We have an old tenant sweeper that we've need to have, since we moved in the new building, 3 times it's broke down and needed major repairs. It's one way to keep, we have a lot of salt and sands and dirts that get on our floor. The old sweeper creates a lot of dust. There's no scrubber component to it. Those would probably be down the line. Could we reuse our snow blowers? Yeah, but how much more maintenance is it gonna take next year if we have another bad winter? It's just one more thing to say. Okay, last year our request was $1,029,000, which is more an average ask.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Kipley?
And I just add that the highway department's kind of already on this, the 5-year plan is kind of inherent to what the highway department does to be eligible for grants and different things. All their projects, all their work has to be on a 5-year plan. So then they've got a corresponding 5-year plan for all the replacement of what equipment. And I know this is, I can't remember the dollar amounts, but this list was longer than the 25 and 26 lists. So,
Quite a bit.
so that might be helpful context. I'm getting a sense from a couple of my colleagues that just like we were looking at the 5-year, maybe I've got as the liaison, I've seen a little bit more of that, but maybe working with Abby and Susan, some of those similar 5-year outlook graphs of, are we running down the highway, like we feel good about the cash now,
Yep.
but after we do this, after what you'd be thinking of the projects we do this year, next year, the 5-year plan, could we see what the projected reserves in the highway fund would be over a certain period of time and how we can level that? Is it?
Yeah, we have those numbers we can get to you.
Yeah.
Um,
So it might just give a sense that in the broader context of a 5-year outlook, some of these are fairly routine requests would be my perspective on it, but absolutely, I think it's fair to ask those questions and get that context.
Right now, our highway fund end of the year last year was budgeted to be 7.3 million. At the end of this year, it's forecasted to be 7.3 million. Next year, it's 4 million with this budget and these purchases. About 4.1 million after 26, 4 million after 27, and 3.2 million after 28. There's a lot of projects listed on 28 that are part of that 5-year plan that you need to do state grant applications for. Not all those projects would come to fruition.
So yeah, in your world, the 5th year is a little bit artificial because you just throw everything in the kitchen
Correct.
sink on it so that it's technically on it to be eligible for grants.
And
But
just like previous years, our revenues are really strong again this year. Just as the auditor was talking about interest income, we budget making about $15,000 a year on interest on the highway fund dollars. And we were in the 80,000 after April already, so we're probably going to be in that $260,000 to $280,000 in interest income this year. Our budget for this year for contracted construction looks really high, but there's $2.5 million of state and federal funding that aren't counted towards that because of reimbursements. That money would come back next year, and that's part of the reason why our ask is smaller next year on projects because we'll be realizing a revenue then.
Other questions? So I hear that Steve's going to come back to us with a little bit more information about how this affects that.
Yeah.
The
this
5-year
is all-
plan?
This $1.992 million number is included in our 5-year projections I just read off to you. But I'd be happy to get those to you.
Is that what you were asking for? I just want to make sure we get what the commissioners were asking for.
I think we might just ask for a visual representation. I guess what I'm asking for is almost a little bit of apples to apples of like how we're looking at the general fund and a lot of Susan's presentation there. Can we just get the different iterations of in kind of graphical form of how we're drawing down that fund? And maybe what I'm hearing from you is the argument that sitting on 7.9, whatever that reserve is sitting on too much. And if we have the money in the highway, we need, the citizens deserve us doing projects, not just sitting on cash, even though we're getting a lot of interest on that cash. That's nice.
Yep.
But your job is to do work and do these projects and be effectively applying for grants and matching that with state and federal dollars. But yeah, basically just seeing that in the context where a $2 million sticker price to all these equipment might sound high, it fits into the broader context of a plan to get to, if a 4 million is more of our target, you are achieving that over kind of a 4 to 5 year plan.
We've had discussions in my 2 years here about where our target should be in the highway fund, and we've always thought it should be what it's going to cost to replace a bridge that would have a catastrophic failure. And that's always been considered to be that $3.5 to $4 million mark, but we've never really set a firm target on what the number should be. So, but yeah, I can get you a graph showing our projections the next 5 years.
Okay. I think is that what you were asking for too? Or is that helpful to some of your broader context questions,
Yeah.
Commissioner Bleiberg?
Yes, that's very helpful. I feel like the explanation answers my questions. I don't need further information based on what you just informed us of. Thank you.
Commissioner Bennigan.
Well, the first thing I would say is I wouldn't say next year or last year was normal.
No.
I don't think we've had one of those in 40 years.
Right.
The other thing is we've had a roller coaster ride on projects over the last 5 years or more. So I would be concerned if, in fact, we're delaying a project for any reason. That seems to be a priority. And the other thing that I'm always questioning, when I look at the auction vehicles, there's lots of times we put stuff on the auction and our surrounding counties buy some of that for very reasonable prices. I'm wondering if we could get more details on what we're replacing, like the pickups, how many you have in inventory and what kind of mileage you have and how old they are. I think that's important for us to frankly answer some of the questions that not only we've heard today, but things we hear from other contractors that say we have the best fleet in the state. So I think we have to be aware of that, especially after we've raised property tax values.
Mm-hmm.
So to have questions answered before they become problems would be a good idea for us.
Okay.
Other questions? All right, thank you, Steve.
How about if I just tie you in and we just talk about fleet management
Sure.
for just a minute? The handout that I gave you talks about fleet management, and Commissioner Karski mentioned that a few minutes ago. And not long after Steve came to the county, he said, has the county ever looked at doing this? And I got really excited. But unfortunately, he's had his plate full with building and some staffing changes and different kinds of things that are out there. So we're now starting to see Steve work on this particular project. He started to talk to people, and I'll just let you, this is the handout, the last one that we had. Not ready to put dollar amounts to things yet, although I know Steve has been doing some penciling in that area.
Counting pickups, cars, vans, trucks, heavy equipment, trailers, and small equipment. The highway department currently has 151 assets that would be considered fleet assets. We looked at all the other departments, not counting the sheriff and the jail. And right now, the other departments with pickups, cars, trucks, SUVs, vans, heavy equipment, trailers, and small equipment, we're at 78 units that are being managed by other departments. That would make the county's total number of units at 229. Of those, for pickups, the other departments have 19, the highway department has 21. And we do have all the data showing what years and models and mileage all these vehicles are. If you'd like additional detail, we can provide that to you next Tuesday. We're looking at numbers of what it would cost us to maintain. That some of the departments do a really good job of maintaining their vehicles, going through private vendors, talking with a few of the department heads. Since our department head meeting a couple weeks ago, they're all excited that it's something that the county is considering, is doing a centralized fleet where the highway department would help them identify which vehicles are in dire need of replacement that makes the most sense to replace. We can help them come up with numbers for their budget submittal this time of the year for what a rough estimate for the cost would be the following year. And once the budget is passed, we can help that department acquire that vehicle and get it into service. The highway department would maintain these vehicles. They can get fuel at our shop. We're working with Sioux Falls on hopefully giving a combined fuel depot at out by their new public safety facility, which would then open our vehicles up to being able to fuel at other Sioux Falls locations, kind of like the sheriff does now. They'd be able to use our vehicle wash out at highway. We're just looking at what those costs are, what the other departments are currently paying for those services. But a lot of the costs, like the administrative time in researching vehicles, ordering the vehicles, disposing of vehicles, things like that, there's no set numbers. They're just part of their administration costs currently. So it's something that Carol and I have been talking about for a while, and now as Carol transitions to retirement, I'll continue working with Tom Greco and the commission on what your thoughts are with pursuing a centralized fleet.
So just so that I understand, this is just informational. You're going to come back with a little more meat on the bones as to
Yep.
what it would actually look like procedurally, maybe?
Yep.
Okay. Any questions? Thank you.
Yep.
All right, that takes us, well, maybe not. Go
No,
ahead,
we're still
Carol.
going
Okay.
on this one. And if Melinda is available, we will have her take us through, as she comes, outside agencies. Melinda actually is the one who does all the work with the outside agencies, so I've asked her to go through and present on them.
Hello, Commissioners. The outside agency funding provides financial support to various organizations. Funding mandated by statute is for Southeastern Behavioral Health Care for $199,685. That's not an increase for fiscal year '24. The rate is set at $1 per capita based on the state census. This amount has been updated to reflect the 2022 census. And note below that under donations, that Southeastern Behavioral has also requested $5,000 for each drug court and mental health court. Current amounts for organizations under contract are $47,000 to Sioux Falls Area Humane Society for management of strays and other animal control-related issues for Minnehaha County outside of city limits. They requested $49,350 for fiscal year '24, a $2,350 increase. $26,604 to Southeastern Council of Governments for annual membership dues to help the county with grant facilitation. They requested $26,903 for fiscal year '24. That's only a $299 increase. $150,000 to the Sioux Empire Fair Association. They requested $250,000 for fiscal year '24. That's a $100,000 increase for management of the annual fair and other year-round activities. Donations from general funds, the total requested is $1,013,963. That's a $278,482 increase. Outside agency applications were submitted at the end of April. Organizations were given 4 weeks to submit a packet, which included financial information and a list of current board members. Requests for fiscal year '24 are agribusiness, $75,000. That's a $5,000 increase. They've received $2,500 in previous years. Ambulance service providers, $225,000. That's a $45,000 increase. $75,000 will be distributed to each Del Rapids Ambulance, Garrettson Community Ambulance, Humboldt Fire and Ambulance. Children's Inn, $114,085. That's a $23,085 increase. They received $91,035 in the previous years. Now, historically, there's been an understanding that Minnehaha County will provide support for the first night of stay. Note below that they also will receive $26,800 from the Domestic Abuse Fund. The Compass Center, funding for the Family Violence Project was redirected from them to Lutheran Social Services in 2020. However, note below that they will receive $13,400, 20% of the Domestic Abuse Fund. They did request $25,000 to support their other programs, counseling, victim advocacy, and education and prevention. Forward Sioux Falls, $5,000. That's a $2,000 increase. They received $3,000 the previous year. Glory House, $10,200. That's a $5,100 increase. They received $5,100 the previous year. Helpline Center, $4,000. They did not request an increase. Interlakes Community Action Partnership, $5,000. That's a $2,960 increase. They received $2,040 the previous years. Lifescape has received $5,000 the previous year, but they have requested $30,000, a $25,000 increase. Lutheran Social Services, $55,700, a $20,000 increase. They have received $35,700 in previous years for the Family Violence Project. Minnehaha Conservation District, $2,040, the same amount they received the previous years, no increase. By state statute, the county shall provide additional monies required to operate and maintain the district. Sioux Falls Development Foundation, $10,000, a $9,490 increase. They have received $510 the previous years. Sioux Metro Growth Alliance, $9,500, a $4,000 increase. They have received $5,500 in previous years. Domestic abuse funds are sourced from marriage fees and divorce fees, not from general funds, and the amounts distributed are $26,800 to Family Visitation Center, that's 40% of the funds. $26,800 to Children's Inn. Is that, pardon me, yes. It's $26,800 to Children's Inn, again, 40% of the funds. And $13,400 to the Compass Center, 20% of the funds.
Thank you. Questions for Melinda?
Madam
Just
Chair.
one question. Oh, go ahead, Commissioner Kipley.
I was just going to ask, how is this baked into the general fund projections that we heard earlier from Susan? Are we using 23 baselines or the requests or?
We've updated the animal control and CCOG dues due to the fact that they're contractual
Okay.
related. The rest of them have not been increased.
We're just using the 23 base.
The
or
23 base
Yeah, the 23 baseline.
is included
Okay.
in the 24 budget with the exception of the Sioux Falls Humane Society and CCOG,
Okay.
which
That's,
were between the two of them, maybe $3,000 increase.
that's helpful. Thank you.
My exact same question. So, Any other questions? Thank you very much, Melinda.
You're welcome.
You aren't done with highway yet. We're going to talk about the highway fund summary. Susan and Steve are going to go through those.
So we'll just walk through this slide for you. It shows 2022 actual, 2023 revised budget, and then 2024 requested budget. As Steve kind of indicated, the highway fund's cash reserves starting the year were well-funded, around 10.2 million. And that includes accruals for receipts in 2023. The revenue remains strong. 14.6 million was the actual for 2022. And 23 budget is 16.4 million, with 2024 is just over 16.8 million. As you go into the expenditure side, these numbers for 24 include all of the vehicle and equipment requests that Steve had already previously highlighted. And you can see the deficit in 2023 of 4.7 million. A number of that is due to spending of 2022 budget and 23 due to unfinished projects and unable to go forward projects and things like that. Maybe if you want to.
And some equipment that we were unable to get, some equipment we were unable to get in 2022 where that money was moved into 2023. And of that 4.757 million, as I said before, about 2.3 million of that would be reimbursed later from state and federal funding for projects going this year.
And as you get to the ending balance, about 5.5 million is the ending balance in the cash reserve. I like to point out that about 1.6 million of that is considered reserved fund balance. That's related to your
Highway 17?
That was 17.
Highway 17 dollars that we'd received that would be used down the road for a project. So those are considered reserved. We don't have ability to just use those on anything. So the projection for 2024 budget, if everything is funded, would be around 4.7 million. Does that number, Steve, include any of that grant money that you just referred to?
Yeah, that includes the money coming in next year for the projects that would be completed this year using big funds and federal funds.
Commissioner Karski.
I thought the 1.6 million was going to be used for the construction for the highway facility.
It wasn't needed for the first phase. It was all covered by bonds, and we're hoping when we get around to doing phase 2 that we'll come to the commission to use that 1.6 million for phase 2.
Okay. I'm still stuck on the bulldozer, Steve, so another question there.
I understand.
You know, I'm sure you have somebody out there who can drive one, but I know that driving some of that equipment takes years of training and practice. You have that person?
Yeah, we have the operator that used it this winter that came to us from Florida, and he was a bulldozer operator in Florida for many years. And we have at least four employees that have many years each of dozer experience that are very talented on a dozer.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions? No other dozer questions?
Not yet.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
The next slide that we'll just go through briefly is just a summary of our debt service. Gonna make it a little smaller, which is sometimes dangerous. Just so you can kind of get a sense for the smaller bars. We have debt service in two of our funds. The orange represents the debt service being paid out of the building fund. Those are obviously a lot smaller dollars. One of those is the Health and Human Services updates that will be paid off in 2026. And then the other portion that has an opt-out related to it. The other debt is related to the equalization and the highway shop that are being serviced out of that fund. There were no additional levies or opt-outs created to pay for that debt service. We're paying for that through the existing funds coming into the into the building fund. The blue bar represents the bond redemption fund and the debt service that is being paid for out of there. You can see we do have a big spike in 2024, and that's due to the JJC project that we just closed on last month. That total debt service will be annually around $3.64 million over the next 20 years. And then as you go forward, you'll see a drop in 2028 on the blue bar, the bond redemption fund. That is when our courthouse addition project will be paid off. That will drop the levy around $908,000 a year. That once that bond is paid off. And then, unfortunately, then we have quite a while before the next one is paid off in 2038, which is the jail expansion project. That'll be paid off in 2038. And then after that point, the remaining one we have left is the JJC project that goes out to 2043.
Questions for Susan on debt service? Commissioner Benega.
Just a couple. The 2.1 million that we exchanged, so to speak, with the city on the sale of the two buildings, has that been applied to any of the bond issues, or where is that cash at?
That actually applies into the building fund. We had budgeted money to be spent out of the building fund for that contribution. And with the swap of the 908 CCC building, that would essentially go away, and we wouldn't have that commitment out of the building fund any longer.
Okay.
But it won't change this. This is our debt service because neither of those had debt tied to them any longer. So those were fully paid for buildings.
I'm sure I know the answer to this, but the ARPA funding cannot be used for bond redemption or debt service, correct?
I'm trying to recall specifically what the language is. I do not believe it can be. I think it would be one of those things that, even if it was allowed, I would say one of the things that you should consider is the long-term impact of that. But I do not believe it's allowed.
I agree with that, but the long-term impact is with a negative cash flow over the next few years. That impact is more immediate.
Right. There are requirements where you cannot use it to reduce taxes.
Right.
So in theory, you could say that if you take something that was already levied and then remove it from the levy, that would be a reduction in taxes, and that reduction in taxes is specifically unallowed.
I don't think that's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
Reducing taxes.
Okay.
Would
Other
be-
questions? Oh, sorry,
No.
go ahead.
No, I just want to make sure we verify what our thought process is.
Certainly. Okay. And then our final slide is the building fund summary. And Mark, I think, is still here. And he can step in as if I go down the wrong path. We do have a good cash reserve in our building fund at this time. We did have a transfer of about $10 million into the building fund in 2022. The building fund does have property taxes levied into it. As from an ongoing basis, you can see that our balance for 2025, the requested budget is about $5.2 million in revenue, which is fairly consistent and in line with the last 2 years of budgeted revenue. When you get into the expenditure side, the one thing from 2022, this is that PSAP capital contribution that Commissioner Benninga just mentioned. It's on here because that is part of the revised budget for 23, but it will not be expended because of that, the 908 CCC agreement that was executed. And then we do, as we've indicated, we do have those dollars that we pay for debt service. Out of there was around $1.4 million. So we are looking at this year for 23 and 24 with some additional surplus in that fund. You can see that in prior year for 2022, we actually had a deficit mainly due to the PSAP as well as some of the the admin remodeling and things like that. Mark, if there's things that you want to add?
No, you're good. You can keep going.
Okay. Any questions on this as we kind of go forward with it?
Commissioner Karski.
Where are we spending $250,000 on parking, Mark?
So next year, I'm looking at doing parking lots, or we're looking at, sorry, I gotta make sure I'm on the right side. We're on this year?
Or maybe I got the wrong year.
There's parking. Might be easier to see it here.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, so I'm looking at parking lot I across the road here, 6th Street. That one's in pretty tough shape. That one I was originally gonna do this year along with BNC. There was some discussions with the city as they were gonna move down Minnesota Avenue. There could be some cost savings in there. So that is on halt right now. I'm not sure when they're gonna pick that back up on, but that would be replacing that parking lot and then all of the other parking lot maintenance that I do every year.
Okay.
Madam Chair, have we gotten copies of this? No. Okay. Okay, that's all I had for now.
Other questions on the building fund summary? All right, if not,
Maybe just one thing to add that we've had discussions on that is not reflected in here. There are some expenditures that are in the general fund related to maintenance of our buildings that potentially could be covered by the building fund if we wanted to choose to move them to that fund. So just, those are things that we can think about as you look at your general fund challenges and things like that to see if long-term, if that makes sense. But what we don't want to do is move them over for 1 year or 2 and then need to move them back. So we'd want to have that be a consideration that we do from a long-term plan. That would include like building cleaning maintenance. It would include like fire alarm maintenance, things like that, that we believe would be eligible under the building levy requirements that could be paid under the building fund. That would be roughly about a $600,000 a year budget that is currently in the building general fund that could be moved to the building fund.
Where do we pay our insurance costs from, general or building?
That is from the general fund.
Okay, and that's $250,000 a year?
I believe so. I don't have that number off the top of my head, but that sounds about right.
Okay.
Commissioner Blyenberg.
Would we see any reduction in anything based on the properties that we no longer have that with the city? Would that be on this?
So like the 908 CCC, the reduction, we would see a slight reduction in utilities just because there are some current activities for utilities, and I would probably imagine, Mark, your staffing costs to maintain those properties.
Yeah, it's $3,000 to $5,000 a year is all
Okay.
we're doing. So as far as maintenance, just getting them on.
Thank you.
Other questions? All right, if not, we're moving on to the fee schedule, I believe.
I was just going to make the comment that as soon as the documents were signed on those CCC and 908, I sent a note to the insurance company to take that off our list to go through and do. And I just have to say I'm a little disappointed about the dozer because I really thought I'd get certified and do that in my retirement job. Commissioner Karski.
Benninga wanted to drive it.
Anyway, with that, we're going
I'd
to
like to see the guy from Florida drive it.
we're going to have Tyler talk to you about fees.
I know we're running, our time we made up has disappeared, so I'll be brief. So each year as part of, well, not each year, since last year, as part of this process, departments submit the different fees that they either administer, control, or both. So the information in these slides includes both information from FY23 and from what you're seeing in the 2024 proposed budget. So what are we actually looking at and talking about as far as how much is collected? The Sheriff's Office and Planning and Zoning are by far the areas where we collect the most amount of individual fees. Auditor, Highway, JDC, Treasurer, and Register of Deeds bring up the rear as far as total amounts being collected, and it ranges anywhere from about 22 down to about 3 or 4. So who actually controls those fees is probably the more interesting question. There's 77 unique fees that I looked at, and I was a little surprised that the county actually controls the bulk of those. 41, and when I say control, I mean we have the capacity to change that rate, whether it's increase, decrease, or the way in which it's administered. 36 of which are controlled by the state of South Dakota. Looking at by department how that actually breaks out, you can see that the Sheriff's Office, Register of Deeds, and Treasurer are by far the most constrained. The state controls a majority of their fees. Planning, JDC, Highway, and the Auditor's Office, and Elections melted in there, are all by and large in charge or in control of what their fees look like. Revenue-wise, the maroon bar would be fiscal year 21, the blue is going to be 22. In each year, the state controlled fees brought in a greater amount of revenue than the county fees. I'm not sure what that really tells you. I just thought it'd be pertinent to know that those fees are a bigger contributor to our general overall revenue sources. Lastly, I believe, so how the conversation last year was, well, how old are these fees, and are we keeping up with changing them to make sure we're not losing money, so to speak? On average, the state has last updated these fees that are in consideration in this presentation in 2013. The median, just to make it a little smoother, is 2012. And you note the oldest one that was looked at is from 1968. On the county side, the average date of change was 2015. The median actually is 2021, so the county is doing a better job in terms of keeping up with those numbers. And then our oldest on record is from 1990. And then just to pull out those two old fees, the Register of Deeds transfer fee is last touched in 1968. And that's a significant number in terms of revenue, around $2 million in the last 2 years. And the 1990 planning and zoning fee was for an open mining fee, and that's minimal in the grand scheme of things. So that was fast, but if there's any questions or if there's anything you want to pull apart for next time, I'd be happy to work on that for you.
Any questions for Tyler? Carol. Carol, I think you're having too much fun at budget
Well, I
hearings
have
this
to,
year.
I am. Tyler, do you just want to mention, because, you know, that 1968 kind of throws us a little bit, but why that's not as scary a number as what we would think originally it is?
I will try. So the way it's designed is it's actually a ratio of the amount of property value that's being transferred. So while it's gosh, they haven't changed it in 60 years. Well, it's able to keep up with itself because the market value of the property that's being transferred is actually what ends up driving the revenue based on that transaction. So I don't know that you can fully make the argument that it should be changed or shouldn't be changed, but it's able to kind of keep up with itself.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Commissioner Kipley.
an interesting set of descriptive statistics, I guess, but maybe the simplest thing for us would be all those that have the county control. Just as a new guy here, can we just get a list of those, what they are and when they were last changed? I think.
So yes, I can do that, but I believe it's also as part of in the Dropbox that you all received in each department. If a department has fees, it will be included with their narrative.
Okay.
But I'll put it together and make sure to see have it in one spot too.
Other questions? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So that takes us to item 8. Did you want to hop up, Carol? Or do you want me to do it? Okay. So this is the point in the program where annually we just kind of give direction to the commission office as to who we would like to hear from at our next budget meeting, which happens to be next Tuesday. So, for example, I think frequently we ask to hear from anybody who's asking for a new position. That would be something that I think I would be interested in hearing. I'm guessing Commissioner Karski wants to hear about dozers. Anybody else have things that they particularly are interested in hearing about?
If I may?
Yes.
Yes. I think if I remember from past financial action networks, 92% of our budget is state mandated and about 7% is state authorized. So we got about a 1 to 1.5% discretionary amount that we can control. And it's typically to our outside agencies. Some of it is funded through the marriage and divorce fees, et cetera. So I mean, when we really look at our, where do we say no most often? And, some of them, ambulances, we've been doing our best to try to keep up and help them. And I think we need to. I'm in favor of some ambulance fee requests. I don't know exactly the dollar amount. I got a few things penciled in. But I'm just, running through my mind the wisdom of bringing in outside agencies to, justify their requests to us. Typically, it's an emotional issue or, the need, and it's very difficult to say no. So if we don't bring them in, we just say no, and we don't hear that emotional side. But
I would point out that all of them did have an opportunity to come and present to us over the course of the year.
over the last 4 or 5 months, they did, but, they didn't really come to us and say, I'm going to be asking for 300% increase in my budget. So, those are when I write numbers down, that's, other than a bulldozer, that's, the ones I don't circle a lot. So, I'm just opening that for discussion at this point. If, where we're going to look at things that we may say, yeah, that's a great idea, but we don't have the money. So,
A question, do we ask those outside agencies for a written narrative to go with it? That's all. I sense you're answering a lot of my questions here. I guess I would be willing to review their written requests. I don't know that some of them had very large increases that I would be interested in what their justification is, but I'm happy to just read that justification.
Mm-hmm. Very true. Thank you.
Personally, I'd say that we don't have a history of significantly funding any outside agency, and even for some of the requests that are made, I don't know that it's worthwhile to have them come and spend time talking to us about it. So
I'll read the narrative.
anyone else?
The outside agency requests, did we have that on paper?
No.
I'd like that on paper if I could.
All right. Well, obviously, if you have some other items that come to you at 2 a.m. this morning or something, you could call Carol tomorrow morning. Not at 2 a.m. though. So we will, that's the conclusion. There's a list of the important dates there. I don't know if you wanted to run over those again, Carol, before
Just to look at my chicken scratches for Tuesday, because we'll regroup immediately after this as we look at the Tuesday's agenda. And do you want us to go back over those forecasts, those cash applied, that 5 years? Susan and I were just talking briefly, thought maybe that would be a good thing just to touch base again for you guys to keep in
And I
mind.
think we are going to have some conversations, and need to have some conversations about, different strategies with cash applied and opt-outs. And so I would hope that you would bring some of that forward so that we can have a little bit more detailed discussion about coming up with a strategy that we all agree on as to how we would like to do that.
Okay. We will bring that forward again. UC3 staffing, I know they've been working on a PowerPoint. I saw draft 1. I think Mike and Susan are already on draft 3 or 4 at this point. So that will be ready for you to go through. Steve will be has already sent to his staff information to put together on the highway equipment stuff. Remember, they are closed on Friday, so that will be on Monday before we're able to get that information from him to go through and do. So do you want, just for my clarification, do you want every single department who asks for staff to come in? You typically don't.
Yeah.
You typically don't.
What I would say is that if you've asked for new staff, we might not ask you to come. I mean, we might not ask you to speak, but if I was you, I would be here. So,
We will communicate that on.
Fair enough.
Okay. And then the information that was missing today, I will have that tacked on to Tuesdays. So you've got everything. You can just keep going back to Civic Clerk and pull that stuff together. I don't know that we'll have all the material posted. The agenda will be posted 24 hours in advance. I don't know if all the material will be posted 24 hours in advance. So you guys have done an incredible job asking questions today. Thank you.
so final words, Tuesday will be a long day. So eat a good breakfast before you come. Because the commission meeting unfortunately probably won't end too much earlier than we start going to budget. So I think Carol has a plan to avoid hangry commissioners at some point, so. All right. I think that's the end of a regular meeting, so this is opportunity for public comment. Anybody here on public comment? If not, I guess I need a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion passes unanimously. Thanks everyone for being here today. I know it's a long meeting, lots of information.
I just want to get